Hi there. This video is going to cover the topic human impact on biodiversity. It ties in strongly with other topics such as adaptations and distribution and the biodiversity topic, three topics from AS2. So you'll often find when you're looking at questions on this topic that there'll be links, there'll be bits of the question to do with the other topics as well. So often you'll have bits of adaptations, bits of distribution, bits about biodiversity, and then maybe a bit tagged into the question about human impact on the environment. So to get most benefit from this video, you'll need access to my set of my notes here and a set of questions, question booklet. For the reason that I'm going to constantly refer to the notes as I go along here and give page numbers and so on, and the notes for you to refer to. And I'm also going to refer to questions as I go along as well. So you need all this in front of you. Okay, so let's have a quick look at this topic. So as I suggested on the front page of the notes here, you'll see that this is basically about this topic's about how human activity impacts on our environment, and you'll see the sorts of things that we're going to be looking at. Now, most of the activities tend to relate to many of the activities relate to farming and food production activities in the countryside. So you see things like monoculture, pesticides, pollution of waterways, global warming, and damage to forests and hedgerows. And many of these are directed at the impact of farming on our environment. So I'm going to move fairly quickly. I'm going to some of the questions, some of the topics are a wee bit less important, and others are more important in the sense that they tend to generate questions. So I'm going to move fairly quickly through the topics. First of all, maybe to say that question 9 in the question booklet there is a recent essay question, which covers all of the aspects nearly of this particular topic. So question 9 basically asking you about how farming has a negative impact on biodiversity. So you'll have a look at question 9, we'll refer to it later on. So just working our way through the topics, working our way through the areas one by one. First of all, we've got monoculture there at the start. And in no particular order, these areas in terms of their significance, significant impact on the environment. Monoculture simply refers to what farming tends to do. Farming tends to focus on one crop, one activity, one food production item to the exclusion of all the other crops and all the other animals and plants. So, for example, monoculture in Northern Ireland here, monoculture would essentially be relate to the fact that most farms are involved in producing grass for the feeding of animals, and then the animal products then are derived from that. So monoculture is essentially a definition of growing one particular species or one particular crop on the farm, and concentrating on that particular crop and excluding all the other crops. So monoculture in general, with regards to the environment and biodiversity of plants and animals, is not so good. First of all, in regards to biodiversity of plants, monoculture, as its name suggests, you're only cultivating one plant species, and therefore you're excluding all the other plant species. The most obvious other plant species are anything that the farmer or grower considers to be a weed. Weed being any plant which is growing on the farm, effectively growing among the crops, which is not meant to be there, and is seen as damaging to the production of the crop. So any weed at all. So that if you exclude weeds in general, then you're removing plants. You're removing plants. You're reducing plant biodiversity. You're also removing sources of food and habitats for uh, animals uh, um, and birds that would exist around the farm, exist in the countryside. So monoculture is not good then for a biodiversity of birds or insects or butterflies and those sorts of organisms that feed off all sorts of plants. So lack of monoculture then reduces habitats and available food resources. And there you only get a few, birds and bees and a few different types of butterflies existing. In general, monoculture is thought to cause increases in disease and pests associated with a particular crop. Because if you keep the same crop growing on the farm year after year, then if a disease gets into the crop, then that disease tends to persist from year to year, and it tends to get worse and worse because the crop's always available each year. In turn, same with pests. Pests that feed on that particular crop, so say a particular insect. If you keep growing the crop every year, then you maintain a constant, the same food source available every year, and the pest itself then always has its most appropriate food source available to it, and the pest can often overwinter, sort of hibernate in the form of eggs, or hibernate within the local hedgerows or wherever, and then it re-emerge in the spring to feed on the same crop. And so what you get, you tend to have pest problems associated with monoculture. You're growing the same crop each year. The argument would be that if you change the crop, if you grew grass one year and then wheat and then say potatoes and then say some other crop, that by changing the crop then the pest doesn't have a stable habitat and a stable food source, and the pest therefore is likely to diminish after the year in which its favoured crop is produced. In fact, for some crops, the Department of the Environment, Department of Agriculture, DARD as they're called, Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, DARD, sets down laws that say you're not allowed to grow that crop each year in turn. For example, potatoes are only allowed to be grown once in every 7 years, because there's a pest associated with potatoes called potato root eelworm that damages the potato plant. And if you grow potatoes each year, that potato root eelworm numbers in the soil increase and totally damage the crops. You're only allowed to grow potatoes once every 7 years in the same field. You have to, as it were, rotate the crops. So an alternative to monoculture, then polyculture, is having a range of different crops on the farm, or rotating the crop from year to year. Polyculture and crop rotation are essentially the same thing. Stopping pests establishing. If you have fewer pests, then you need fewer pesticides. Pesticides are essentially chemicals that kill pests. The definition of a pest is any species that causes economic damage on the farm. So pesticides are any chemicals then used to kill pests. Within the range of pesticides, then you have chemicals to kill weeds, which are called herbicides, and chemicals to kill insects, which are called insecticides. So those are the two major pesticides: insecticides to kill insect pests, herbicides to kill weed pests, and those are the two major sorts of chemicals that farmers are using. So you've less, if you don't have monoculture, then polyculture, you have less pests about the farm, and you have to do less spraying of chemicals. And we'll come later on to discover that less chemicals sprayed around the farm is a good thing too. If you have polyculture, if you don't have monoculture, then monoculture tends to exhaust the soil of specific nutrients that particular crop needs. So for example, if you're to grow potatoes each year in turn, potatoes need put a very heavy demand on the soil in terms of nutrients, and extract minor nutrients from the soil, and they keep extracting those each year in turn, such that the soil becomes exhausted, and therefore the productivity of the soil and the yield of potatoes decreases after a number of years because you've used up all the crops. And then just generally, as I've said, polyculture allows for increased species diversity. So you have a range of different plants on the farm. Then you then have a range of different animals, birds, bees, insects, etc., etc. Arguments against polyculture: farmers would say, well, we're better to focus on one particular crop, and we become an expert at growing that crop, and that crop maybe gets the maximum benefit in terms of maximum profit for that particular farm, or it suits the soil of that particular farm. And also farmers would argue that growing the same crop each year means that you become specialised and you have specialised machinery for that particular crop, and you don't then have to each year get new machinery or different machinery. So having said something about monoculture, and said monoculture may encourage a lot of pest species growing on the farm, particular pest species. And so whenever we come and just talk about dealing with pests and how you can control pest numbers, often it's not a case of totally getting rid of the pest species. Often that's not possible within the farm or the crop situation. Usually the idea is to try and keep the pest numbers at very low levels, at low enough levels so that they are not causing economic damage. So you can keep the pest numbers down pretty low, then you can still make the crop can still be profitable. Now, if you do have to use pesticides, then pesticides are basically chemicals to kill species, and often they're not very specific. That is, if you spray the pesticide onto an area, let's say you spray a weed killer, it tends to kill all the plants in the area except the crop. These pesticides, these weed killers have been designed so they don't kill the crop, but they kill all other species, all other plant species. So if you kill all the other species, then you remove food sources and habitats. Anyway, in any exam question, always mention if you reduce the biodiversity of plant species, you can get rid of plant species, then you're removing food sources and habitats. You need to mention those terms with regards to animal species, and that reduces the numbers of animal species. Now, just in relation to that, then something that comes up, and this is also done at A2 level. The next topic, which is pest resurgence. Actually, the whole topic of pests and pesticides is done to a greater extent at A2. The next term we're coming to is this idea of pest resurgence. And you'll see that graph that I got there, that graph then actually came from an A2 question, but it's quite a nice graph. Essentially what it's saying is that if a farmer has a situation where he has a crop, he or she has a crop growing, let's say wheat, and he discovers there's a pest eating the wheat. For example, aphids, APHIDs, aphids are a common pest. They're a common pest in lots of crops. They tend to be specific aphids that eat wheat, and then there's ones that eat potatoes, and ones that eat flowers and all sorts of things. So the farmer discovers that there's these aphids growing his crop, and he or she decides then to spray a pesticide to remove the aphids, to get rid of the aphids, because they're causing damage. Only to discover that initially the spray is effective, the number of aphids go down, but then suddenly it goes up again, and it goes up again, and it goes up higher than it was in the first place. This is referred to as pest resurgence. And what it comes down to is this, is that in spraying the first time, the farmer has not appreciated that whilst the pest numbers appear quite high in his crop, there is also a predatory species there. It may be another insect that's living in the crop. It's actually keeping the pest numbers at a sort of regular level. And by spraying the chemical kills both the pest and the predatory species that's controlling the pest. And as a result, then once the predator is removed, first of all, the pest numbers go down because the chemical kills the pest, but it also kills the predator as well. And as soon as the predator is destroyed, then the pest numbers can surge away up again. Pest numbers can resurge, and that's that sudden rise then in pest numbers. So it's very important that farmers recognise that there may already be that even though the pest numbers in the plant and in the crop may look high, they may already be being controlled or kept at that level by a whole range of different predators, and many of them will be predatory insects. Other things that will be keeping them numbers down might be wasps, who tend to be predatory on other insects, and of course wee birds and bees and sorts of things may be actually feeding on the pest species and keeping their numbers down. So it's important to recognise that. So generally spraying with pesticides tends to be temporary and often counterproductive. And the other thing about pesticides, about these chemicals, is often first of all, they're not they're not specific. We would describe a chemical like that kills lots of different insect species as a broad spectrum pesticide. Broad spectrum, it kills a wide range of species. And what we've discovered in the past is also that these chemicals, these pesticide chemicals, often persist in the environment. In other words, you spray the crop now with the pesticide has its effect, it kills the pest, but the pesticide may remain and persist on the crop or in the soil, or it may get into local waterways. And one way or the other, it doesn't go away, it doesn't get broken down. If it does get broken down, the term is used there, we say it's biodegradable. It breaks down in the environment, or it breaks down once it's inside the body of the pest. So that if the dead pests are eaten by, say, birds, then the chemical doesn't get into the birds. This idea of biodegradable essentially means that the pesticide is broken down in the environment. And many previous pesticides in past years weren't biodegradable, so they remained in the environment. They were non-biodegradable. And then a consequence of that was that they stayed in the body of the pest species. And then when the pest species were eaten by predators, then the chemical that killed the pest in the first place was still in the body of the pest and was eaten by the predator. And the term that describes this, the way in which the pesticide may remain in the bodies of the organisms, is the term, and what happens to that pesticide is the term bioaccumulation. And you'll see at the bottom of page 3 there, we introduced the idea of bioaccumulation. And then on page 4 in the notes, I've tried to illustrate that in relation to a particular pesticide called DDT, which was common about 50 years, common back in the 1930s and 40s, so it's almost 100 years ago that it was quite a good pesticide, and it was discovered, and everybody liked it because it was great. It was a very good insecticide. It was a broad spectrum insecticide. That meant it killed just about any kind of bug, any kind of insect species that was about the farm, about a growing situation, inside the farm, on the farm, in the farm buildings, etc. It killed all sorts of pests, and it was hailed at the time as a great pesticide, great insecticide. But only to be, after about 30 years of use, back in about the 1950s and 60s, only then did scientists discover that it was having very deleterious effects, very bad effects. And it was because this DDT was non-biodegradable. It didn't break down. Once you used it in the environment to kill insects, it stayed there. And when it got into the bodies of the pest species, it would pass up the food chain. It didn't get broken down in the bodies of the pest species, and when the pests were eaten by whatever the predators that ate the pests, and the DDT accumulated in their bodies, and then the things that ate the predators that ate the pests, the DDT kept accumulating. As you went up the food chain, you discovered there was higher and higher concentrations of the chemical in the food chain, in the organisms in the food chain. Until in about the 1950s and 60s, it was discovered very high levels of this DDT chemical present inside birds of prey. Birds of prey are at the top of the food chain, and I've illustrated the sort of food chain there. Birds of prey at the top of the food chain were suffering from very high levels of DDT, and the effect that it was having initially was it was causing them to produce eggs that had very thin shells. So when they laid their eggs, the shells were so thin that the eggs weren't viable. The eggs didn't hatch, and therefore after a while the numbers of these eagles in this case started to decrease because they simply weren't hatching out from their eggs. The other thing, of course, about chemicals is that organisms, organisms can become resistant to them. In other words, over a period of time, the organism evolves by means of mutations and so on, something you'll learn about later in A2. The organism will evolve to be able to cope with the pesticide, cope with the chemical, and therefore not be killed by the chemical. So pesticide resistance, and it's the same kind of resistance that develops up with regards to antibiotics. Antibiotics are just chemicals that are used to kill bacteria. Bacteria develop resistance. They evolve to be able to cope with them. And so you can get resistance to all sorts of chemicals, weed killers, insecticides, and so on and so forth. So, in recent years, farmers and growers have been looking at alternatives to using chemicals in the environment, recognizing that these chemicals are not always the godsend that they appear to be, and not always as effective as they should be. Predator strips are just areas around the predator strips. Just the general idea of leaving like a fringe around your field, a fringe region where you don't put crop, that you just leave wild plants growing there, and that allows the predator organisms, say they're some other insect or birds or whatever, to live in that little strip and survive there, not be sprayed with any chemical, not be attacked, allowed to grow there in numbers. That gives them habitats and food, and allows them then to move out from that predator strip into the crop and keep a pest species under control. Disadvantages of predator strips is that they're a little strip around the edge of the field, possibly about a metre wide. Usually here in Ireland, such strips you regard the hedgerows and the area beside the hedgerow is like a kind of a predator strip. But if you don't have hedgerows and you actually have to leave these strips at the side of the field, then they take up space, and farmers might argue, well, that space we could be growing crops. So this may be an argument against having those. But something of recent, a major development recent, is the idea of using biological control. Biological control of pests. Just before I come to biological control of pests, just want to look at one or two questions there. So I'm looking at, I already mentioned question 9, which is the essay question, which basically covers all of these areas and asks you to talk about all these areas. The bioaccumulation question, question 3 there, is a very old question, which is bioaccumulation. It's difficult to get a question. There hasn't actually been a question asked at AS about this yet, but you see in that particular question, it shows a green plant. In this case, the green plant might be living in water, or it might just be well, in this case, it must be in water because we're dealing with the small fish, large fish, and osprey. So this might be a green plant that's growing in a river, and often plants that are in river clog up the river, and sometimes you'll find that the plants are either cut to open the river up properly, or sometimes they get sprayed with a chemical to kill them, or the chemical may percolate or leach out of the local farmland into the river and then get into the plant, and then it gets into the small fish, large fish, and so on. And you see the concentration goes up as you move up the food chain. And that's a reasonable question then to have a look at. So I'll leave you with that question, question 3 on the bioaccumulation. Moving on then to biological pest control. Now it's dealt with in this AS topic, but only briefly, only mentioned in passing, but dealt then with very substantially at A2 in two A2 topics. So as I often say to students, these ecology topics at AS, that is adaptations and distribution, biodiversity and human impact on the environment, strongly support topics at A2. At A2 and Module 4, there are 2 big ecology topics which account for some 40% of the marks in Module 4. And these topics here, these topics give you the basic background information or supporting information which would help you at A2 then. So biological pest control is dealt with strongly in Module 4, dealt with to a large extent in Module 4. And basically the idea of biological pest control is the idea that that there may exist already a predatory species among your crop that's actually controlling the pest. Or if there isn't, that you might be able to seek out a suitable predatory species from some other part of the world or some other area. Seek out a predatory species that might be able to control the pest for you. And so you could introduce this predatory species into the crop. It may be usually an insect species, and it would then control the pest for you and keep down the numbers of the pests, and therefore improve your productivity, improve your economics. Now, biological control isn't always just a predator. It may be a pathogen. So there have been instances in history where pathogens have been introduced. Pathogen meaning a bacteria or a virus that might be introduced into the pest species to try and kill them off and keep their numbers down. The classic example of that was a virus that was introduced into rabbits in Australia. Rabbits had overrun Australia, in terms of their effect on production, food production. And so a virus was introduced into the rabbit population that caused a viral disease called myxomatosis in rabbits, and that very effectively controlled the rabbit population in Australia. It brought down that they died off effectively. It was a very nasty disease. It actually, that disease, if you check out its history, actually made its way to Europe and to Ireland. And in the 1960s, the disease had made its way here to Ireland, probably through infected rabbit meat or whatever. And so the local rabbit species in Ireland, which were having no noticeable effect on farming and weren't an issue, weren't really a pest, numbers were kept down. Then their numbers of rabbits here in Ireland started to die and started to decrease. And this was a terrible disease. So here in Ireland, we'd have many maybe predators that would eat rabbits. Such predators didn't exist in Australia because the rabbits were introduced from, I think they were introduced from Britain into Australia as a food source, not realising there was no predator for them, nothing that eats them. Maybe dingoes, I suppose, but it wasn't the numbers. The number of predators weren't sufficient to keep the rabbit population down. So biological pest control. The classic example of biological pest control is the use of something called a ladybird. A ladybird's a little insect, about the size, half the size of a 1p coin, but it's very efficient at feeding on aphids. Aphids are a common pest. Aphids are a small species of insect that suck plant juices. Basically, they suck the juices out of the phloem tissue in the plant. And those juices contain essentially the products of photosynthesis that the plant has made and is moving around the plant as sucrose. And so these aphids suck out the sugars into the plant, and that effectively destroys the production of the plant. But ladybirds are quite good at controlling them. A typical ladybird is thought to eat about 20 aphids a day. And if you can introduce ladybirds into your crop that's been affected by aphids, then the ladybirds may effectively control the population of the pest. So these biological control organisms. Now, to introduce a biological control organism into a crop, you have to ensure a few things. First of all, this predator, I say it's a predatory insect, then you have to be sure that it actually eats the pest. And you have to be sure that the predatory insect can survive on the crop. Well, first of all, it needs to work. It needs to eat the pest in large enough numbers to control the pest, and it needs to do it fairly quickly. Because no point in it doing it over a year period, because typically a crop is planted in springtime and harvested in autumn. So there's probably a period of about 6 months there when the crop is growing. And if you introduce the predator, say in springtime, it needs to work quickly to keep the pest numbers down. So that's the first thing. It needs to actually kill the prey species, kill the pest species quickly. It needs to be able to survive. It doesn't need to have to be constantly reapplied. In other words, you don't have to keep introducing new predators. The other thing is it should only attack the pest species and not attack other local species, because you don't want it attacking other local species in the environment. Then it starts affecting food chains and so on, and starts disrupting disrupting the natural run of things. It shouldn't eat the crop either. Importantly, that the predatory species eats the pest and not the crop. And it should establish in the area quickly and do its job quickly, get rid of the pest species quickly. But as I say, this is looked at in more detail in upper sixth. You can ask then about what are the advantages of biological control compared to pesticides. Well, it's quite obvious. Well, maybe even just from the farmer's point of view. Pesticides are expensive chemicals as well. They're expensive to apply, and you may have to apply them several times during the growing season for them to have an effect. So there's the expense. If the farmer can do something that's cost less, then that's good. The other advantage then is more from a wide environmental advantage. So you're not using pesticides, then you have all the advantages of not putting chemicals into the environment, no bioaccumulation, no disruption of food chains, etc., etc. So, of course, there's no development of pesticide, no development of resistance with the natural predator. lower costs, no possibility of pest resurgence, and if they're effective and not too expensive, then it seems like seems like a no-brainer, as it were, in terms of the environment. Okay, next area I'm coming to is the topic of pollution of waterways. Pollution of waterways. Now, this is something you would have done at GCSE in your ecology topic at GCSE. So I'm looking here at question 2, and question 2 and question 7. Question 2 would be initially question 2. So you remember some of this from GCSE. You remember something called eutrophication, and eutrophication was about how farmers might allow fertilizer to leak from their fields. Well, they didn't allow it, actually, it just happened. It might leak, or leach was the correct word, out of the soil into the local waterways. And in the end, that resulted in low oxygen levels in the waterways and a decrease in biodiversity, loss of organisms and so on. But here at AS level, we have to make a proper distinction because the distinction between the source of the material that's going into the rivers and causing this problem. I said rivers and waterways can be polluted by adding either organic matter or fertilizer. Now maybe above the word fertilizer there you could write above the word fertilizer you'd write inorganic fertilizer, because we have to make a clear distinction here. Organic matter would refer to things like sewage and slurry and other such materials that are organic in nature. Fertilizer in this instance refers to the nice clean chemical fertilizer stuff that you buy in the fertilizer shop and sprinkle on your lawn or sprinkle on your fields. It's nice white clean chemical, whereas the organic fertilizers are the smelly ones, sewage, which you wouldn't put on your land but could get onto the land. Slurry, everybody knows about slurry, the smelly stuff that goes onto the fields. So we have to make a clear distinction here. And you get a slightly different effect in the water. You get a slightly different run of events if you let slurry into the water, slurry or sewage, as compared to letting fertilizer, inorganic fertilizer, the nice clean stuff, percolate into the water. So we're going to look first of all at organic matter. And I've said there's slurry. You could add after slurry sewage, sewage with the other. Slurry and sewage are the two things. Now, here's what you need. I've got a sequence of steps there, basically setting out what exactly is going to happen. The organic matter acts as a source of food for bacteria that already exist in the water. So water always contains bacteria. And if you let sewage or sludge or slurry or silage effluent is another example of such stuff. Silage effluent is the sort of liquid that runs off the preserved grass that farmers keep. It's called silage. It's basically preserved grass. That can get into the rivers as well, into waterways. And so when I say these things get into the waterways, sometimes it's done deliberately to get rid of them. Other times it's just inadvertently. They sort of leak through the farmland and make their way into the local streams and then the local rivers. So organic matter, first of all, acts as a source of food for bacteria that live normally in the water. Once you put the organic matter, the slurry or sewage, into the water, then the bacteria have a very large source of food. Basically, they start to feed on this organic matter. And then the bacteria numbers increase massively. And basically, as they feed on the organic matter. Bacteria then are doing respiration. They're using up a certain amount of oxygen in the water all the time, but because their numbers are now massive, they're doing a lot of respiration, using up a lot of oxygen. And they place, you could say they place a very high oxygen demand on the water. So they take a lot of oxygen out of the water because there's a lot of bacteria. This is sometimes referred to as BOD, the BOD of the water, biological oxygen demand of the water. So we say if you get a lot of bacteria, the BOD of the water goes up, because that simply refers to the fact the bacteria need all this oxygen. And then if the oxygen, basically oxygen has been removed from the water, then the oxygen, other species then that are in the water depend on oxygen, then their numbers are going to go down. So I'm just looking at question 2. It's asking you to calculate a percentage there, which you can do. You can see it's a very big percentage because it basically removes nearly all the oxygen from the water. explain the decrease in oxygen content. You'd say sewage or slurry or whatever gets into the water provides a source of food for bacteria. That's point number one. Then you'd say bacteria feed on the sewage and their numbers massively increase. Number two, and then you'd say the massive number of bacteria then use up the oxygen that's present in the water, and that's essentially it. That's your 3 marks. And then there's various other parts of that question which you can look at. You can look at. That's quite a good question. So that's question 2. I won't go through all of that question, otherwise I won't get this finished. Okay, so question 2. Just at the bottom of page 7 in the notes there, you see a little graph that relates the reduction in oxygen with the increase in BOD. So the BOD is like a kind of a reflection of the oxygen curve. So as the oxygen levels in the water go down, it's because the BOD, the demand put on oxygen in the water by the bacteria, has gone up. Downstream from the site of the pollution and the site of the introduction of the organic matter, then gradually you'll see that the oxygen content returns, and you could get questions that ask you why does the BOD decrease, or why does the oxygen content, you see at the top of page 8 there, it discusses reasons why the oxygen content essentially would increase again, and that question's been asked before. And this idea of indicator species is covered quite nicely there on page 8. Indicator, well, first of all, basically just looking at the species that are the organisms that are present in normal water, and you'll see there over from 0 to 5 on that graph, you'll see that there are species such as stonefly nymphs and mayfly nymphs and so on, and it says those are freshwater organisms. Those are organisms that normally live in water that's got adequate oxygen in it, and you see then as soon as you get the organic discharge, that's the slurry going into the river or whatever, you see that there's initially there might be no organisms at all, because there's almost zero oxygen, or the water might be just so dank and full of sewage that there's no organisms. And you see shortly after that, you see organisms have accumulated. They're called bloodworm, sludge worm, and rat-tail maggots. Those species would be regarded as what you would call indicator species. The general term indicator species simply means that when you look into a river and you see certain species present, those species give an indication of the oxygen content of the water. So, for example, if you see those rat-tail maggots and bloodworms and so on, then they indicate the water has been polluted. You see, you might not actually see the polluting material, you may not see the sewage, because that may have happened some period before, but in the water now has got a very low oxygen level, and those presence of those species indicate that there's low oxygen level in the water. The absence of the other organisms, the one that were there in freshwater, is also an indication that the water contains a low oxygen level. So indicator species then are just a quick way of looking at the water for people who are qualified in this. Ecologists are able to look at rivers and look at the quick scan of the species that are present. They can give a good indication of whether the water has been polluted by sewage or not. Yeah. Indicator species, as I say, then are a quick visual indication of how the oxygen content of the water. So that's what happens if sewage or slurry goes in the water. Now you have to make a clear distinction then between that and what happens if fertilizer goes in the water. And by this I mean inorganic fertilizer, the nice clean stuff, the nice chemical. And it said pollution on top page 9, pollution by fertilizers, eutrophication. And that's a term you do remember then from GCSE, the term eutrophication. And most students at GCSE could have written you down 6 points about that. They would have said things like fertilizer gets washed into the water, washed into the local waterways from farmland. And often it's washed in because if fertilizer is applied to the farmland and then there's a period of rainfall, period of heavy rain, then that's likely to wash the fertilizer into the rivers, into the waterways, because the fertilizer itself is very soluble. It's very soluble. It dissolves easily in the rainwater, and then it gets washed down into the local waterways and makes its way into all the local rivers. And then the next stage, all students at GCSE will tell you that the next stage is something called algal bloom. So algal bloom only relates to this artificial fertilizer. Algal bloom essentially means that because there's a lot of nutrients, and the nutrients you might specify what the nutrients are that are in the fertilizer. Nitrates would be good, phosphates would be good, But if you remember nitrates, that's a good example. Nitrates and phosphates get in the water, then they're taken up by microscopic plants that are in the water. And the microscopic plants are there all the time, but they're there in small numbers. They're not so visible. So the water, normal water, doesn't look very green because it looks pretty clear. It's not very many. But if you looked at it down a microscope, you would see that there's lots of microscopic single cell plants. And these single cell plants are algae. If you've done the topic on biodiversity, these fall into the group Protoctista, single cell plants, algae. And these are in the water, and the fertilizer goes in the water then. They take up the fertilizer, and their numbers start to increase. They simply multiply by mitosis and make lots of algae. And this is referred to, the water then starts to develop a sort of a greenness, and this is referred to as an algal bloom. Algal bloom is just the growth of the algae. Now, once you get a lot of algae in the water, after a period of time, some of the algae in the water start to die. Because initially they can do photosynthesis, but if you get so many algae in the algae down near the bottom of the waterway are getting less light, and therefore they can't do photosynthesis, and essentially they start to die. The algae down near the bottom will die, and as soon as they die, then you basically have material, you have a food source for bacteria in the water. So the dead algae and the slurry are equivalent in essence, because the slurry was a source of food for bacteria, the dead algae are a source of food for bacteria. And then from then on you say the dead algae are a source of food for bacteria. Bacteria feed on the algae, bacterial numbers increase, bacteria use up all the oxygen in the water. And as soon as the bacteria use up all the oxygen in the water, only those organisms can survive that are adapted to cope with low water oxygen levels. So we're talking again, going back to page 7, we're talking about our rat-tailed maggot and our bloodworm and our sludge worms. They're adapted. They're quite good at coping with low oxygen levels in the water. So eventually, I'm just going back to page 7 there in the notes, sorry, page 8 in the notes, you see that eventually, and if you notice the distance here, we're talking about maybe upwards of 5 to 15 kilometers downstream. It may take you to go downstream 15 kilometers before the water is has refreshed itself with oxygen, and the pollution has dispersed, as it were. Okay, page 9 then, a discussion about, a quick discussion just about how do farmers and growers stop water pollution? Well, essentially, first of all, don't put any slurry and sewage into the water. Store it properly in proper tanks on the farm. This is usually often a problem on the farm. Farms with large numbers of animals produce large amounts of feces and urine from those animals, and often the farmer can't cope with it quick enough. If it's produced in the winter time, the farmer, he or she cannot take it out and spread it on the fields as a kind of fertilizer. So often they have to store it, and if it's not stored properly, then it'll easily leak away into down with gravity down into local streams and so on. So that's the first thing. Don't put these farm wastes into rivers. Store them in appropriate tanks. I'm just reading through the list here. And don't apply fertilizer close to waterways. Don't put fertilizer close to the rivers and streams. Don't apply before heavy rainfall, because if it's going to rain heavy, then it's going to wash all your fertilizer out of the soil. And not only have you get polluting the local streams and rivers, you've lost all the fertilizer that you've applied to the land. You've wasted your time, as it were. Apply only fertilizer when plants are growing actively. In other words, apply fertilizer at the start of the growing season, spring and summer. Don't be applying it at the start of winter. the plants, not during winter, and so on and so forth. So there's actually a whole raft of different things that farmers are advised by by DARD. They're called DARD. This is the government authority that looks after this and regulates and controls what farmers can do and what they can't do, and puts laws in place, and actually often will fine farmers and growers for doing the wrong thing. Department of Agriculture and Rural Development used to be called just the Department of Agriculture, but now they're they look at all certain aspects of the countryside. Number of questions there at the bottom of page 9 about eutrophication and so on. Worth looking at those. Top of page 10, discussion just of why farmers should generally use organic fertilizer rather than inorganic fertilizer. In other words, they should be using slurry and stuff, putting farmyard manures, it's called, putting that onto their fields. Use that rather than the artificial fertilizer, which is the bought stuff. The inorganic fertilizer, sorry, the organic fertilizer, the farmyard manure, and that generally improves biodiversity because it contains a wider range of nutrients for plants than the artificial fertilizer, which tends to focus just on a few nutrients like nitrates and phosphates and potassium and so on. So you get a broader range of nutrients, that means a broader range of plants, so you get greater biodiversity. Farmyard manure is less easily leached out of the soil. Farmyard manure and slurry tends not to be soluble, so it doesn't dissolve through the soil as quickly. And it's also good for the structure of the soil. Farmyard manure is good for the structure. So there you are. A couple of questions. So I think I mentioned there's a couple of questions there. In question 7 also relates then. So we had a good look at question 7. So moving on then to another area that most students will be aware of, and that's global warming. And I'm not going to spend much time on this because essentially students are aware of global warming from 4th year, and they know essentially that it involves the warming up of the planet, essentially. And most people know that it's down to gases that are being released by human activity. And the main gas is carbon dioxide. So we constantly hear about carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere, essentially from the overuse of fossil fuels. Burning too much fossil fuel then releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. There are other gases. Methane is a much worse gas, but it's released in smaller amounts than carbon dioxide, so it doesn't get mentioned so much. Methane comes from farming activities, mostly from farm animals. Methane is produced from both ends of farm animals, and it gets into the environment. So the more farm animals we have, the more intensive our agriculture, the more meat we eat, the more methane has been released into the environment. So farming gets a bad press then with respect to global warming as well. It's a major contributor. But of course, all industry contributes to global warming. How does global warming happen? The standard question: carbon dioxide released into the environment causes the carbon dioxide levels in the environment to increase. When I was at school 50 years ago, the carbon dioxide levels were 0.03% of the atmosphere. Recently, the value is 0.04% of the atmosphere, carbon dioxide. So you might say, oh, very tiny values. They're both very tiny values. But if you note that 0.04 has 33% higher, it's gone up by a third. So in 50 years or so, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has gone up by 1/3, by 33%. So possibly in your lifetime it may double. And if it's allowed to double, then we get this so-called runaway greenhouse effect. So increased CO2 going into the atmosphere is the first mark. Then you would say that the CO2 acts as a barrier or a blanket to the loss of heat from the earth. Acts as a barrier or blanket. Blanket's a good term. And that blanket then traps heat close to in the atmosphere, and the temperatures are gradually increasing. And there's little scientific doubt now that this is happening. It's still disputed. What's the major problem with global warming? Major problem is a warming up of the atmosphere, and that from GCSE is thought to be associated with weather changes in weather patterns, extreme weather patterns. So we might have more rainfall in winter, and more storms, and more hurricanes and so on. And the other thing is loss of habitats. If you get higher temperatures, then Arctic and Antarctic habitats will be lost because the ice will melt, and so the common perception that polar bears are finding it difficult because they're losing each year they're losing a percentage of their habitat at the North Pole that's available to them for hunting and so on. So you will get extinction of species, extinction of quite a lot of species, and in general, then you would also find distribution of species in the north away from the equator. So for example, if you have a species that can only survive around the equator where it's quite warm, you may find that that species is also now being found further north from the equator and further south, because the temperatures in these further north regions has increased sufficiently. The classic example that's mentioned is the mosquitoes. Mosquitoes, which normally only live in the equatorial region, stay around the equator because it's warm enough there, are now being found in more northerly locations, such as France and south of England, and found in southern Europe. The term that relates to where the distribution of a particular species is its ecological range. And what we're saying is the ecological range of mosquitoes has increased because they can now live in more northerly regions. You could say that the ecological range of the polar bear has decreased because it's now happened to move more towards the North Pole where it's cold enough to preserve its habitat. So the ecological range. A question was asked at A-level, an upper sixth, about carbon dioxide levels there, and you'll see why are carbon dioxide levels higher in the winter around the world. But generally they're higher in the winter because you could argue there's more fossil fuels being burnt in the winter. This is in the northern hemisphere because it's winter in the northern hemisphere and it's summer in the southern hemisphere. So, but generally in our hemisphere, carbon dioxide levels are higher in the winter because more people are burning more fuels to keep their houses warm, and also you might argue there's less photosynthesis happening, so there's less carbon dioxide being taken out of the environment because crops are not normally growing as much in the winter. So you turn the page there, you'll see I've included then a page about this idea of ecological range of a species, and I've discussed a number of different species then whose ecological range might be being affected by global warming and other changes in environment. Just with regards to farming, another thing that farming tends to do is to drain. Farmers tend to drain land that is wet and boggy. It contains a lot of water. The argument being that if they can drain that water, excess water away, they can bring what would otherwise be an unproductive piece of their land into farming by removing excess water. And as we know, you can't really farm areas that have got a lot of water. You have to remove the water from the soil to make the soil more fertile. However, many of those wet areas, so-called areas, are referred to as wetland areas, and they tend to be habitats for certain species, like frogs and newts and lots of insects and lots of birds that are specifically wetland birds. And so by bringing those into farming, those wetland areas into farming, you're removing habitats for wetland species, so there are fewer habitats for wetland species. So you can have a good look at page 11 there that discusses that. Probably the last thing we're going to talk here is about trees and woodlands and so on. And there's a lot of emphasis then recently by the Department of Agriculture and Development in Northern Ireland in the establishment and the maintenance of trees and bushes and hedgerows. Hedgerows being essentially acting as fence-like arrangements around farmland. By the way, just before I leave the global warming area, there is a question about global warming there. I should just maybe point it out to you. It's question 10. Should have said that. Question 10 relates to global warming, and it's quite useful. Question 10 because it's the sort of question that they like to ask you at AS and A2 level. They're not just specifically asking you about global warming. They're telling you about the consequences of it, and then they've asked you questions there about. They've told you about the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, and they've asked you to discuss what they've written there, and then ask, give some evidence from what you see there from the text that it's humans that are causing global warming due to our activities, or arguments that are put forward by some scientists that say that it's not us that's causing global warming, that global warming is more a sort of a natural effect that happens on this planet over a long period of time. So you have to make judgments based on the text there, but essentially it's reading through the text and extracting the important information from the text. So leaving global warming, as I said, and coming on to hedgerows and native woodland and so on. And the pointed just towards question 1, which is a big old question about hedgerows and discussing the advantages of hedgerows. Hedgerows, we would call them here just hedges, and they would just like you see them as you drive down the road. There's always usually a boundary between the road and the farmland, and that's a hedge. And then within the farmland, you've got these hedges as well, which are there. What are they there for? Well, traditionally they've been there. They've acted as a sort of a shelter for animals. They've acted as a boundary to stop the animal moving from field to field. Often the hedgerows are made of spiky and thorny bushes, and that prevents the animal getting through. And they often have boundaries between farmlands and so on. But from a biological perspective, they're also very useful with regards to maintaining biodiversity. Because first of all, within the hedgerows, you've got a wide range of plant species present. Usually, as I say, most of them are quite spiky and dangerous, not dangerous, but quite damaging if you get in there among them. So you've got thorn bushes, black thorns and white thorns, and briars and stinging nettles, and all the usual sorts of things that if you fall into a hedge, you'll get stung, you'll come out with thorns sticking in your skin and so on. So they make quite good barriers, but they're also very good food sources. So within that hedge, you have lots of food that butterflies and bees and wasps and insects and all sorts of things are living in there. Rabbits are living in those hedges. Foxes may be in among the hedges as well, so they're actually food sources. So you would say there are habitats, they provide habitats and food sources for lots of different animals. And it also describes movement corridors, in the sense that species such as rabbits and birds and so on can move along the hedge, can travel through the hedge or along the hedge around the countryside, so they allow an easy movement for species. Those species can stay inside the hedge and in that way stay away from predators. Movement corridors, and they provide shelter for lots of shelter and nests and so on for lots of animals. If you remove them, essentially, you're removing a large number of different types of plants. You're reducing plant biodiversity and ultimately animal biodiversity, food sources and shelter. So you can maintain biodiversity on the farm. Farmers are encouraged to keep hedges in place now. 50 years ago, farmers were advised to remove hedges. They're actually given grants by the DARD, grants being sums of money to remove hedges. The idea being if you remove hedges, you have more space on your farming, you do more farming. More recent understanding is that DARD has decided we should put hedges in, and put new hedges and replace hedges and repair them and so on, because they are very good for the environment. And so increased farm biodiversity by maintaining hedges at the bottom of page 12. There's a lot of points there which are relevant, and you could well get asked then questions about hedgerows and maintaining them and so on. Alongside hedgerows, then you have this idea of native woodland. And native woodland refers to any areas of trees that are in the countryside that are natural, local grown trees. The trees that have usually have been there for a long period of time. So you're talking oaks and ashes and sycamores and beech and elm, all local species. In contrast to imported trees, and the imported ones tend to be the ones you would regard as like Christmas tree type trees that you see planted often planted up in the mountainous areas. Usually they provide wood for buildings and paper and furniture and so on. They're not local they're not local trees. Most of them are imported from Northern Europe, from Norway, things like Norway spruce and things with cones on them and so on, and Leilandi type species that you see quite common around planted around houses to act as kind of screens. Those are none of those are local. The local species are much better. Local species, because they're species that local animals and birds live in. They're good food sources, and they're often habitats for rare plants growing in among them. So if you've got a local forest, then you often find that there's lots of species growing in there that you want to preserve. Whereas the imported species tend not to be good for nesting or food or any of those sort of things. So we're encouraged now to increase woodland. So farmers are given grants by DARD to plant new trees, plant new bushes in their hedgerows, plant areas of forest, even to encourage increased biodiversity. On page 14, look at this idea of protecting rare and endangered habitats. So generally, the Department of Agriculture and Development set the task of trying to protect areas that offer high biodiversity, areas that exist already within Ireland, within Northern Ireland. And so you have these, you have what are called initiatives, and really these initiatives often come with shortened terms, ASSI, Area of Special Scientific Interest, an Area of Special Scientific Interest. The other one that comes to mind is SAC, Special Areas of Conservation, and these are just names given to schemes or grant schemes that the DARD would run, whereby they will designate a particular area of the countryside or a particular place as, for example, an area of special scientific interest. That means it's protected. It means that people may be allowed to go into that area, but they're not allowed to shoot animals or hunt, or not allowed to cut down any of the trees. And basically, it's a protected area because it's got very, very high biodiversity. But very commonly, it's because it contains species that are so rare, or so few of them left, that you have to preserve that area, otherwise that species disappears. And so you'll often get questions that relate to that. I'm just looking to see if there's a question, if there's such a question exists there. Often it's just, well, at the end of the essay question 9, it does ask you for, it says, discuss initiatives that have been introduced to conserve habitats and protect biodiversity. And you have to come up with 3. I notice there it says ASSI, and you have to come up with 2 others. Another one is a BAP. I think it stands for Biological Action Plan. So these are just names given to initiatives or schemes that the government has dreamt up, the Department of Agriculture dreamt up. Okay, the last page then is really just a sort of an overall discussion of all of these different, of all of the ideas to do with farming and biodiversity, and things that farmers can do, how farmers can encourage biodiversity. So really, as you go down through that page, you should see most of the things that we've mentioned so far as we go along. Okay, thank you very much. All the best. Bye.